Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine war, I guess, a mixture between a breaking news update and a geopolitical update and analysis, because right now there is the aftermath of the Riyadh talks between the US and Russia about Ukraine without Ukraine, highly controversial. And so that's ongoing. There'll be lots of news coming out, and some of this will be sort of out of date, no doubt, by the time many of you watch this. Nonetheless, it is what it is. Hopefully a lot of useful context as well. The first thing I'm going to say is we need to understand the broader kind of White House American political landscape context of these talks. There's a lot going on here, and I think what you are seeing needs to be understood in terms of actually, and some of you may like roll your eyes, but in terms of Elon Musk, so what has been happening there? And we're going to start with that before we get on to the actual talk, because you have to know this. What's going on with Elon Musk? What's going on in the context of social media regulation in the EU? And I think the US wanting to attack the EU and side with people who are against the EU, i.e. Russia. I think you're seeing a realignment of the US with Russia. I don't think they care too much for the outcome of these talks or of any peace negotiations in terms of what Ukraine get. It is all about what the US get, and this is being confirmed by stuff that's now coming out of the Riyadh talks. So this is not me having a go at the US because I'm ideologically opposed to the Trump administration. This is literally what they are saying. If you read what is coming out of the talks, this is exactly what's going on. So the context in terms of social media and Elon Musk particularly, and you can also extend that to his need for natural resources from Russia and China, and why both Elon Musk and people like Marco Rubio, Donald Trump, JD Vance never insult Russia or China is because they want stuff from them. This is all about transactional gains, and at the heart of those transactional gains is Elon Musk. So it comes with no surprise then, and this is absolutely disgusting, by the way. It's disgusting. The man is I think evil. Elon Musk yesterday said and referring to another horrible entity, Mario Norfa, when they were reporting that Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, was alighting from the plane at Saudi Arabia, Elon Musk said, this is what competent leadership looks like. Lots of people have been incensed by this, saying competent leadership, does that look like murdering Ukrainian civilians? Is that competent leadership? Because that's what you are advocating for. So you have Elon Musk advocating for the Russians here. So when you're talking about 180 shift, this guy's at the center of the White House. He's able to do what he likes. He is slashing and burning the US government, whilst also, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, he's also getting rid of all of the institutions in the US that are presently investigating him, so that he can increase his business empire, and also operate more freely in Russia and China. Now, he goes further than advocating for Russian leadership by now also advocating for Călin Georgescu, who is a Russian shill presidential candidate in Romania who had undue Russian influence to give him that extra boost in the presidential elections that caused the Romanians to cancel the presidential election and rerun it and do an investigation. That is who Elon Musk is advocating for. Russian Foreign Minister Călin Georgescu, and now as well, actually previously Alice Weidel from the AfD, right? So we are also hearing that in the slashing of USAID funding, Moldova has lost $22 million intended to support the electoral process there after the decision of Doge and Elon Musk. So he's also neighbouring Moldova, neighbouring to Romania. He's not only advocating for the pro-Russian candidate in Romania, he has slashed funding to enable free and fair elections to take place in Moldova more easily, and therefore is supporting Russian influence in Moldova. And then, of course, AfD as well. And we know that JD Vance met with AfD's Alice Weidel himself. And that Alice Weidel has met with the Chinese ambassador Wu Keng, not at the embassy, but at her own house now for years. So the connections between the AfD and China, the AfD and Russia, and the connections of Elon Musk to the AfD and to the pro-Russian political movement in Romania, possibly in Moldova, and then also Russia itself directly, means that it is no surprise if the US is doing an about face with regard to support for Russia. And we'll talk about actual support for Russia in some of the rhetoric that's coming out. I mean, it's absolutely unconscionable. It's insane what's happened in the last month or so. And I am so tired of people on my threads still spouting the pro-Trump rhetoric that this is somehow good for Ukraine. All of this is not good for Ukraine, to the point where, let's listen to Zelensky himself. Ukraine will not participate in the negotiations in Saudi Arabia, even if I am asked to. Zelensky emphasized that Ukraine does not recognize any agreements concerning itself that were made without its participation. I can't believe that you would try and sort out the future of Ukraine without Ukraine. Just talking to Russia. It is so insulting. It is morally egregious. It is just not right. It is morally wrong that you would do that. It infuriates me. He also noted there's likely a bilateral track in the US-Russia relations, but Ukraine will not take part in these negotiations. He's come out now and warned that an ill-considered end to the war in Ukraine could lead to an Afghan-style scenario. He emphasized that no agreements about Ukraine should be made without its involvement, and called on the US to play a more active role in ending the war. Called on the US for Ukraine to play a more active role, I presume that is. Julia Davis says, look, and this is news about, this is a press release on the Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov's telephone conversation with Marco Rubio. So before the meeting, there was this telephone conversation between the two that really told, when you look at how the Russians are playing this, it is all very beneficial for the Russians. And not for the Ukrainians. Julia Davis from Russian Media Monitor and the Daily Beast said, this is disgusting. Notice that the Russians are making no concessions. So in these telephone calls, all the concessions, including that which is being discussed by the US, as in the US are pushing for concessions from Ukraine, but no concessions from Russia. And Julie Davis says that rightfully, this is disgusting. The Russians are making zero concessions, are offering the US precisely nothing of value or importance. Meanwhile, the Trump administration is ready to give Russia whatever Putin wants, just like they've always said he would. It's in my book, she says. This is entirely to be expected, but it is nevertheless absolutely terrible. Edward Hunter Christie talks about, Medusa, the Russian exiled media outlet, says Putin is in open talks with Zelensky, but the question of the Ukrainian president's legitimacy must be taken into account, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said on Tuesday. In other words, Russia are even saying, well, we can't really speak with Ukraine because the president is illegitimate. Are you having a laugh? Edward Hunter Christie saying Trump team idiots are making the discussion a walk in the park for the Russians. Moscow is rapidly entrapping USG with its logic of aggression. There's no way America walks out without making multiple damaging concessions against Ukraine, against Europe, and maybe even against the US itself. That's why we fought among friends of Ukraine right from the start not to talk at all with Moscow. To talk with Moscow is to begin to lose. You act towards Moscow, you don't talk. And this is exactly my position. The fact that the US is talking bilaterally with Russia and not with Ukraine is despicable. It is to normalize genocidal aggression. Let's imagine, we're going to talk about, Hitler invading Poland, or Hitler invading France, or Hitler invading Belgium, but without any of those leaders, just the US and Hitler. How can we have, and we're going to talk about this in a second, because the US has reiterated how they want a fair outcome for Putin. So imagine going to Hitler after killing 6 million Jews and say, oh, mate, we just want a fair outcome for you here. But not fair as in justice, as in the fair outcome for you would be you being, executed or put in prison forever, right? That's a fair outcome for Hitler. Fair outcome for what is meant here is we don't, we want to be all right for you. Are you all right, Hitler? Are you okay? Are you all right, Putin? Don't want you feeling bad about this. So we just want it to be fair for you as well as for, who are the other people? Is it Ukraine? Anyway, that country we're trying to extract natural resources from. Those are people. We want it fair for both of you guys. What was his name? Zabriskie, Zamoni, Zelensky. That's it. So anyway, for Poots, for you and Zelensky, we just want this to be fair. As long as you're all right with that. Nice one. I find it disgusting. So the whole premise of the meeting in Riyadh is, in my opinion, disgusting, right? And I do not adhere to the, well, you know, you got to get to the table. Blah, blah, blah. This is about appeasement of Putin. You get Putin to the table by screwing Russia so much that they are forced to the table. But this is what they're doing to Ukraine. But forcing them to the table, but saying, not yet, Ukraine, not yet, we're just talking with your enemy, not yet. Are you okay? You're right. Yeah, we'll do this deal. Yeah, not yet. No, you're right. And now you can come to the table. Oh, you're screwed. Oh, well, we'll just extract everything from you along with Russia. There you go, Ukraine. We've carved you up. Sorry about that. Anyway, US are the good guys. No, they're not. They've turned into the bad guys, the adversaries of what is good and right, proper and decent, democratic and fair. And I find it disgusting. So the Kyiv Independent reported that we agreed to consider each other's interests, says Russia. The Russian negotiator Ushakov, and we'll talk about him in a second, is not good. So we agreed to consider each other's interests, the US and Russia, each other's interests, not Ukrainian interests. You are freaking deciding the future of Ukraine that you've invaded. Oh, we in America are just going to sort out our own interests in this. Yuri Ushakov, an advisor to the Russian President Putin, said it was a very serious discussion of all the issues we wanted to touch upon. What about what Ukraine wanted to? This is what Putin wants. This is what Russia wants. The US are capitulating to Russia. This is, again, disgusting. It is not good enough. Right, more. Russia's UN permanent representative, Nebenzia, claims Ukraine has irreversibly lost Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia. He added that the war's hot phase may end soon, insists the EU and UK can't be part of future Ukraine deals, and demands Ukraine to be neutral and demilitarized. This is what Russia wants. The question is the US going to facilitate this happening? And if they are, the US are now the enemy. It's that simple. Russian media's first reports from, and when I say that, I mean the Trump administration, of course. Russia's media's first reports from the US-Russia negotiations, the TLDR, says Anton Gerashenko, is it's all US's fault. Russia is blameless. The US were hit by sanctions much harder than Russia. Biden's policy has undermined confidence in the dollar, while sanctions have helped Russia become more independent. Of course, it's absolute nonsense. Dialogue with the new US administration allows us to tell the truth. The policy to contain Russia has failed. Many American companies have lost their position in the Russian market and their future approaches. Progress in Russia-US negotiations is possible in the next 2 to 3 months. Russia and the US need to move on joint projects, including in the Arctic. Do you see what's happening here? Russia are manipulating the US to work together on making money and doing stuff elsewhere and lifting sanctions on Russia so they're all fine and dandy. Oh, it's lovely. Oh, do you know we just genocided a bunch of people in Ukraine? And the US is like, yeah, we know about that. Anyway, how should we work on oil? What should we do about hydrocarbons? Don't really want you guys exporting too much to Europe at the moment because we're exporting our LNG to Europe, and Russia goes, yeah, okay, well, don't worry because we'll do some stuff together in the Arctic. And meanwhile, everyone's forgotten about the murder of the Ukrainians. Honestly, this is what's happening. Questions about Ukraine's involvement were ignored during the Riyadh talks, according to No Reports and this article here. US and Russian officials dodged press inquiries on whether Washington is sidelining Ukraine and what concessions it seeks from Moscow. Meanwhile, negotiations continue in the Diriyat Palace. Well, actually, they're over now. So much to take from this. Right. First of all, exactly what I said. This is about what the US can extract from Ukraine and what they can make economically by working again with Russia. This is nothing to do with a just peace. There's nothing to do with a just peace. This is to do with the US becoming economically even better off as a result of this war. Ukraine peace is, quote, the key to unlock economic opportunities with Russia. Marco Rubio says, right? The US State Secretary says that part of the focus is on ensuring that our diplomatic missions can function and lead vibrant diplomatic relations. Vibrant diplomatic relations. I want vibrant diplomatic relations with Hitler. Yeah, you know the guy that killed 6 million Jews? Let's have some vibrant... let's be really vibrant together. Hitler. Good old Adolf. It's disgusting. He then... The second element is to conduct peace talks. The second element is conduct peace talks with Ukraine. Okay. So the main thing is to just get on like a house on fire with Russia and do some economic deals, which he says will include engagement and consultation with Ukraine. That's nice. And partners in Europe. Again, how kind. But he says ultimately, at the third step, the US wants to move to, quote, engage in identifying the extraordinary opportunities that exist should this conflict come to an acceptable end, to partner with Russians geopolitically on issues of common interest and, frankly, economically. That is an absolute disgrace. I'm sorry, but anyone defending the US diplomatic entourage in Riyadh at the moment needs to get their head checked. Or at least understand that the US doesn't care one iota about Ukraine. They care about enriching themselves. That's the only outcome here for the US that they have in mind. Really, that's what's driving everything. Quote, and don't believe me, listen to the Secretary of State himself. Quote, obviously the diplomatic one is one we hope to move pretty quickly on because this involves a treatment of our respective missions. The second one will be difficult, which is a question of Ukraine and the end of the conflict. The second one is the end of the conflict. The second thing, he's just told you, the second one will be difficult. That's a question of the end of the conflict. But the diplomatic one, the important one is our respective missions, engorging ourselves economically. He continues, but I think that's essential in order for the third to even be possible, which is our ability to work together on other geopolitical matters of common interest and, of course, some pretty unique, potentially historic economic partnerships as well. The key that unlocks the door for those opportunities, however, is the end to this conflict. There is nothing about justice here, nothing about justice, and everything about America engorging themselves economically. It's absolutely incredible. Right, what else do we have? Again, Marco Rubio. Everyone needs to be okay with agreement, US Rubio says, and hints at the EU role needed to remove sanctions on Russia. So all he wants is the EU to remove sanctions on Russia. What's important to understand, he says, is two things. The first is that the only leader in the world who can make this happen, who can even bring people together to begin to talk about it in a serious way, is President Trump. The second thing I would say is that in order for a conflict to end, everyone involved in the conflict has to be okay with it. Has to be acceptable to them. He says today's meeting was, quote, the first step of a long and difficult journey. He says that in order to bring an end to any conflict, there has to be concessions made by all sides. But it would be wrong to predetermine those. He hints at the role for the EU for further down the line. He is going to be involved further down the line, saying that, quote, there are other parties that have sanctions. The European Union is going to have to be at the table at some point because they have sanctions as well that have been imposed. Quote, the goal is to bring an end to this conflict in a way that's fair, enduring, sustainable, and acceptable to all parties involved. What that looks like, well, that's what this ongoing engagement is going to be all about. Sorry, they got the transcription wrong there. So interesting that there's no mention of justice. There's no mention about a just peace. And honestly, words matter. If he's not mentioning that there will be a just peace, a just outcome for this, it means justice for Ukraine is not a concern for the United States of America. Meanwhile, Russia is saying they are looking for sanctions relief. Leading Moscow's economic negotiations is Kirill Dmitriev, the 49-year-old head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund and close friend of Putin's daughter, former investment banker. He's played a key role in Russia's outreach to international investors. US oil majors have done very well in Russia, Dmitriev said in a brief interview on Tuesday morning before the talks began. We believe that at some point they will return. Why would they pass up the opportunities Russia has provided for access to its natural resources? He said. So this is about economic relief. absolutely incredible. So my goodness, there's so much coming out um, about this. What is there anything else here? Um, yeah, I'll have to get into looking at that soon. Any deployment of NATO forces in Ukraine is completely unacceptable, Lavrov says. So there you go. They are laying out their maximalist. Remember, they're going to go for their maximalist objectives, and the US has already given away Ukraine's maximalist objectives. So they've already said you will concede your territories, and that the US won't have troops in Ukraine. And then they change that, say, actually, we might have troops defending American interests, i.e., the extraction of natural resources. So it's not really for the defense of Ukraine or for peacekeeping. And the US has already said that Ukraine won't be in NATO. They've kind of had to row some of them back, but they've effectively publicly given away the Ukraine's maximalist objectives while allowing Russia their maximalist objectives. So if you're then going to meet somewhere in the middle, with Russia being at the bottom, Ukraine at the top here, Ukraine have had to give away this, and so now the middle is much further to the Russian objectives than it would have been had the Americans not given away those cards already. So this is all horrendous. Yes. So then we talk about the agreement between the US and Russia about embassies being reopened. I mean, this is basically appeasing Russia 100%. But the EU has said that they will not lift sanctions against Russia, even if the US does the opposite. So that's a European Commission. I'd like that strength there. The Union will pursue its own sanctions policy and introduce the 16th package. According to French Foreign Minister, the next package of anti-Russian sanctions will affect the Russian energy sector. We've also had, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, Keith Kellogg, the envoy to Ukraine, speaking to the EU. The EU wants to work alongside the US in a critical moment for Ukraine, Ursula von der Leyen has said. And she's been fairly strong there. She's reaffirmed the EU's commitment to a just and lasting peace. Again, the EU is saying the right things, a just and lasting peace. But we don't hear that from America. The President reiterated that any resolution must respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity backed by strong security guarantees. President made it clear now is a critical moment. That is President of the EU. By the way, not President of the US. Von der Leyen presented Kellogg with Europe's plan to scale up defence production and spending, reinforcing both European and Ukrainian military capabilities. She also put him straight on the fact that the EU and Europe that EU without actually UK and Norway and Switzerland have provided more aid to Ukraine than the US. So that was pretty interesting. Okay, what else do we have? There's so much going on. Truly sickening, says this source. This is sickening, truly sickening. The US Embassy has been ordered not to join a simple statement. So, that was it. Appeasement in action. So, again, let's understand the context here. Does it look like the US is working on behalf of Russia or on behalf of Ukraine? Well, now, appeasement in action. 2 days ago, J.D. Vance echoed the Kremlin propaganda by downplaying Russia's aggression and accusing the EU of betraying shared democratic values. Today, the US Embassy in Moscow failed to join this statement of 18 Western democracies honouring Navalny. So Navalny was the opposition politician to Vladimir Putin, who was murdered. And 18 Western democracies honoured Navalny because it was the anniversary of his death, and emphasised that, quote, we continue to stand with civil society and human rights defenders working tirelessly to build a better future for Russia in the face of immense personal risk. The US Embassy refused to co-sign that. And if the US Embassy has been ordered not to join a simple statement condemning Navalny's murder, what's next? Trump sitting next to Russian war criminals on May the 9th stand and applauding Russian murderers marching before him? The victory parade. This is all of the signs are not good for Ukraine and are good for Russia. Michael McFaul, the former Russian ambassador to Russia from the US, Trump negotiated directly with the Taliban, even offered a Camp David visit for these terrorists, and cut out the Afghan government to negotiate an end to the war. We all know how that worked out. He seems to be repeating the same mistake by directly negotiating with Putin. And furthermore, Europeans don't give up on America yet. Trump does not represent us all. Most believe, like I do, that a strong NATO serves US security interests. We need to limit the damage over the next 4 years so that we can rebuild our transatlantic partnership again in the future, which is all good and well. But 4 years of damage to NATO and EU or European relations to the US is it doesn't bear thinking about. This is awful what's going on at the moment. Tatrugami, as a Ukrainian, says several notable meetings between China and Ukraine and statements made during interviews indicate that Beijing is actively interested in the peace process and is open to cooperation with Kyiv. In fact, I think there are some hints that they may be pretty annoyed that they haven't been included with Russia and the US. China is also positioning itself for post-war reconstruction efforts and potential security partnerships. Whether I like it or not is irrelevant. This is a natural and expected development. Moreover, there is a risk that if the US administration continues its anti-European rhetoric, and I'd say anti-Ukrainian rhetoric, coupled with the subtle threats to buy Greenland from its European NATO ally, shifts could emerge in Europe as well. It's too early to draw firm conclusions, and much of it is still very speculative, but one thing is clear: China has no intention of staying on the sideline. And this is absolutely true. Anton Gerashenko said, Chinese military expert Zhu Bo, during an interview with DW, said that China might have 3 roles in the war in Ukraine: to join other major forces in providing a collective security guarantee to Ukraine. China is one of the best options for talking about sending peacekeeping troops to Ukraine, according to Zhu Bo. He thinks that the variant with European troops in Ukraine is unrealistic, but Russia would see it as another way of a NATO presence in the country, participation of the post-war reconstruction. So the signals are strong from China. If Ukraine gets too pissed off with what the US is doing, they could side with China and ask for China to get participation, and then that's Chinese influence in Europe, and then the US lose. If they're strong on being, if they're strong on China and they're hawks on China, then my goodness, they've shot themselves in the foot. Now, Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman for the Kremlin, and said Putin has repeatedly said that, and this is the massive insult here, and this is what the US has facilitated. The insult is the phrase "if necessary." Putin has repeatedly said that if necessary, he's ready to negotiate with Zelensky as well. Oh, if it's necessary, we'll talk to Zelensky about the country that we've invaded and the country whose civilians we've murdered, and the attempted genocide there. If it's necessary to speak to Zelensky, but really we'd like to speak to Trump because we know we can manipulate Trump. Okay. Then we got Mark Galliotti in the Times. I'm not going to go into it, but he's like, Putin is no longer a pariah. The US have made it that Putin is no longer a pariah. He's been brought into the fold, and they're wanting to deal more with Putin than with Zelensky. The US are becoming the enemy. Now, the Trump administration says Kyiv wants Ukraine to reopen its Russian embassies. As mentioned, a directive like this can only come from Putin. Russia needs them to run sabotage, scope intelligence regarding troop movements and locations of air defense systems. Marco Rubio, the US-Russian negotiations on Ukraine have not yet begun. After they start, Kyiv and Europe will be included in them. And he noted that for the negotiations of countries the countries must ensure the normal functioning of embassies. This is terrible. It's also terrible. Now we're going to go back to because this is not over, right? The US want those natural resources. They want repayment for the aid they've given to Ukraine already. But it's absolutely disgusting because it appears that the original deal has now been leaked to the Daily Telegraph. Telegraph has got its hands on a copy of the contract that the US tried to make Zelensky sign last week. Here are the terms that were proposed. They amounted to US economic colonization of Ukraine. So the draft contract between the US and Ukraine outlines terms that are highly disadvantageous to Ukraine. It essentially grants the US substantial control over Ukraine's critical resources, including minerals, oil, gas, ports, and other infrastructure. So that's the ports as well. And this then goes back to exactly what we've been hearing from Marco Rubio. This is all about economic opportunities for the US. This is all about sanctions being lifted and the US gaining economic advantage. A joint investment fund, and we're going to talk about this in a second. The US and Ukraine would form a fund to prevent hostile parties from benefiting from Ukraine's reconstruction. This fund would have extensive control over Ukraine's resources, but it'd be a joint fund with the US. Revenue sharing. The US would take 50% of recurring revenues from resource extraction and 50% of the financial value of all new licenses issued to third parties. There would be a lean on these revenues, favouring the US, prioritising the US claims over Ukraine's needs. The right of first refusal for future licenses. The US would have the right to first refusal for purchasing exportable minerals, giving the US a significant advantage in controlling these resources. Exclusive control. The Joint Investment Fund would have exclusive rights to establish terms, conditions and criteria for the future licenses and projects, effectively granting the US near total control over Ukraine's resource economy. Legal governance. The agreement would be governed by New York law, further tilting the balance of power in favour of the US. And these proposed terms imply a long-term economic burden on Ukraine, likened to reparations typically imposed on defeated aggressor states. The proposed deal would put Ukraine in a position where it must prioritise payments to the US over its own domestic needs. This would hamper Ukraine's economic recovery and sovereignty, effectively making it economically dependent on the US. The terms are exploitative and coercive, treating Ukraine more like a subjugated state than an ally, and placing a heavy burden on the country already struggling with the effects of Russia's illegal war of aggression. The US is the enemy. The US is now seeking to properly exploit Ukraine and extract all that it can from Ukraine like a vulture picking at the carcass, along with Russia. So when I have people like, again, I'm going to use Andy S, but only as a kind of signifier, people like Andy S on my threads who are pro-Ukrainian, right, want the best outcome for Ukraine, but so deeply pro-Trump they can't see any criticism of Trump. Please explain how this is good for Ukraine. How would you do this? Would you be one that would write something that would so capitulate Ukraine to the US, would so get them on their knees, that bend them over the desk and get them absolutely done for by the US? Would you advocate for that? Because I certainly wouldn't. I understand that the US are going to want to have some strategic benefit for helping Ukraine. That's the whole point. But there's a difference between strategic benefit, helping and getting something back. There's a difference between that and then basically violating Ukraine for everything you can get for them and treating them no differently to how Russia is treating them. Russia's sovereign wealth fund chief, so the guy that's been involved in these talks as well, Kirill Dmitriev, that we just heard from, he's a sovereign wealth fund chief. So isn't it interesting that part of the deal that the US want with Ukraine is a sovereign wealth fund on Ukraine's mineral resources? So now a key Russian negotiator will meet with the US delegation in Riyadh. It's increasingly appearing, says Jan Kiev, that Trump only wants to own Ukraine's wealth for not for eventual development, but in order to sell it to Russia immediately for quick cash. And again, transactionalism. So Ron Filikowski from the Midas Touch Network says, what a coincidence that 1, Trump announces the creation of a sovereign wealth fund. 2, he wants 50% of Ukraine's minerals. 3, tried to have Zed transfer it into a reconstruction development fund. And 4, the head of the Russian sovereign wealth fund is part of the delegation meeting with Rubio in Saudi Arabia. Is this all a coincidence? Edward Hunter Christie says, wow, the Telegraph, Britain's right-wing conservative newspaper of record, very supportive of the armed forces pro-Brexit, punches with full force against Trump's immoral attempt at extorting Ukraine, calling it a new Versailles and a second violation, interesting that same word there, second violation of Ukraine. Ukraine, quote, Ukraine cannot possibly meet its $500 billion demand in any meaningful time frame, leaving aside the larger matter of whether it's honourable to treat a victim in this fashion, a victim nation in this fashion. I'm sorry, again, the US is an enemy of Ukraine. I will keep saying that until I am shown otherwise. After it has held the battle line for the liberal democracies at enormous sacrifice for 3 years, who really has a debt to whom, one may ask? In genuine commerce, the other side can usually walk away. Trump's demand is iron fist coercion by a neo-imperial power against a weaker nation with its back to the wall, and all for a commodity bonanza that exists chiefly in Trump's head. It's disgusting. Yet again, it's disgusting. But it's worse than that, because actually it is an amount of money that is greater than what was demanded of Nazi Germany in Versailles. So Trump's confidential plan, US president demands higher share of GDP than Germany's First World War reparations, according to the Daily Telegraph again. The demand for $500 billion payback from Ukraine goes far beyond the US control over the country's critical minerals. The terms of the contract amount to the US economic colonization of Ukraine in legal perpetuity. It implies a burden of reparations that cannot possibly be achieved, as we've heard. The document has caused consternation and panic in Kiev. The US will take 50% of recurring revenues received by Ukraine from extraction of resources and 50% of financial value of all new licenses, etc., as we heard. And that is more than was demanded of Germany, after World War One, not Nazi Germany. The agreement covers the economic value associated with the resources of Ukraine, including mineral resources, oil and gas resources, ports and other infrastructure, leaving it unclear what else might be encompassed, says Anne Applebaum. And again, all the same stuff we heard there. The clause, she says, means pay us first, then feed your children. So this is the lien on such revenues, said one source close to negotiations. So they really are screwing Ukraine over. There's no other way of understanding it. And then, so Michael Weiss, who is great on Ukraine, says, we're now at the stage where America's main incentive in preventing Russia from gobbling up more of Ukraine is that it would jeopardize America's theft, America's own gobbling up of Ukrainian natural resources. That's the only reason you can see that the US would want to stop Ukraine from being further invaded. No longer are we thinking about larger scale objectives and geopolitical narrative and NATO and working closely with Europe and power, influence projects worldwide and the US standing in the world and its hegemonic positioning. This is just how much money can we make out of Ukraine? And if we don't make it out of Ukraine, Russia will make it out of Ukraine. So we need to make it out of Ukraine. Rather than, how about Ukraine making money out of themselves and being able to stand independently on its own 2 feet? No, that's not at all important. And it's got to the point, the Daily Telegraph have written an article where they're referencing US military volunteers fighting alongside Ukraine's armed forces in Ukraine. They are starting to brand President Donald Trump a jackass over his peace deals with Putin, saying Ukraine's future was not a business deal. But now it is. And again, I go back to those people who are saying, oh, Trump's a genius, 4D chess, this is brilliant. Trump is a transactionalist that will screw over anyone for a quick buck. End of. That's it. He has no moral compass. He is, as far as I'm concerned, just as evil as Elon Musk. Prove me wrong. Prove me wrong. Show me Trump's true moral intuitions that he has exhibited in defense of Ukraine over the last 3 years, over the last 20 years. Tell me why he paid $130,000 of his own money to take out adverts in 1987 to slag off NATO, just after visiting Moscow. Why would a real estate mogul do that? Why would they spend $130,000? What is in this for Trump? Why is he beholden to Russia? And he's here to carry on that NATO thing. As I reported yesterday, President Trump privately threatens to pull all US troops out of Europe if Ukraine and NATO don't agree to our peace deal with Russia. Our peace deal with Russia, says that source. And then you've got Mike Lee, the senator from Utah, saying, time to leave NATO, let's go. Who else is with President Trump on this? So the idea is Trump wants to leave NATO, MAGA senators want to leave NATO. This is exactly what Putin wants, the destruction of NATO. And as this person says, these absolute morons are going to destroy the United States. If you're in favour of the US leaving NATO, you either don't want the US to succeed or you don't know what the F NATO does. Worth noting that Mike Lee voted to expand NATO in 2022. So what's happened in those couple of years that's changed? Shashank Joshi says in answer to Sergei Ranchenko, who claims we are deluding ourselves if we think Putin will agree such a peace deal, which is why I think Starmer's commitment isn't worth much. So this is the commitment of getting troops out to Ukraine as peacekeepers. Shashank Joshi says, don't think it's out of question, but right now Putin demands include no foreign troops in Ukraine. So either Trump coerces Putin to change that position, which requires effort, or there is no deal, which is eminently plausible and currently underpriced outcome, or Trump folds. So the view from Shashank Joshi is Trump's either going to fold or capitulate to what Putin wants, which is the same thing. It's unlikely he's going to put in a lot of effort into changing that. So the underpriced outcome, says Shashank Joshi. So quite a likely outcome that we're not really considering as much at the moment is that there just will be no peace deal. Steve Rosenberg from the BBC says, one Russian newspaper yesterday summed up how Moscow views the last few days. Quote, dumbfounded Europe, kneed by America just below the belt, is still struggling to get its breath back. In other words, the Russians are freaking loving this. They are loving it. I find it interesting. David D, someone who, as I've mentioned before, is a very strong Republican, very anti-Biden, very pro-Trump. But actually, here's someone who isn't like Andy S, will just defend Trump to the hilt. He's had a remarkable road to Damascus recently in the last few days on the Trump administration. And he said, I expect in the next few days, many world leaders will stop talking to the USA and things will go quiet. And then Trump will get the message that he is effed up and pushed too hard. Will be too late by then. Or will Trump and Putin just waste a day in Saudi when the rest of the world has already moved past them? So he's saying a lot of things that are really quite critical of how Trump is treating Ukraine at the moment, because actually he understands that Ukraine, he has Ukraine up here as like, I want to defend Ukraine. And actually, if Trump is going to go against that, I will understand that Trump is going against that rather than still defend Trump and try and gerrymander your brain into these compartments that allow for both Trump to be the A1 best guy for Ukraine and for you yourself to be pro-Ukraine. I just don't think you can do that. Now, Dmitry Kuleba, the former foreign minister for Ukraine, has come out and said no ceasefire is in sight anytime soon. And this is after the Riyadh talks. Former Ukrainian foreign minister tells the BBC the game hasn't even started. We're just warming up. We need to pull Trump into a long game instead of rushing into a deal. This is absolutely right. Minsk 3 is seen as the only realistic scenario in the US. And of course, that is not what Ukraine wants. Okay, right, let's just get on to some European stuff just quickly. So Ukraine, on the other hand, like, what is going on with pulling out of NATO? And Trump's position on NATO is he doesn't really understand what NATO's been doing with the US as well. So NATO's just started up this new joint defense center in Poland that is taking on everything they're learning. I think it's called JTEC, JATEC. And there was a speech yesterday, opening speech there. And it's all about NATO learning from Ukraine and blah, 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 blah. And meanwhile, the US, which is on the one hand, the DOD is supportive of all this and doing stuff to learn from Ukraine and work with Ukraine. On the other hand, the people right at the top are going, screw NATO, screw everything. And it's just completely contradictory. The initiative aims to strengthen allied strategies against Russian threats, leveraging Ukraine's frontline experience for the benefit of NATO and ergo for the benefit of the US. Ursula von der Leyen, the EU chief, said now is a critical moment to Keith Kellogg. Situation in Ukraine, it's been discussed with Keith Kellogg on the day when the talks on ending the war between Russia and the US began in Riyadh. Now, this has been quite important. Ursula von der Leyen, I think, is telling Kellogg what for, really, in a polite way. European Commission presidents met with the Special Envoy Keith Kellogg. Ukraine is not participating in the talks, but Zelensky is due to arrive in the country in the coming days for an official visit. Quote, financially and militarily, Europe has brought more to the table than anyone else. So this is telling the US that, no, you aren't the ones that are doing the most of the funding at the moment. Europe's done most of the funding. And we will step up, she says, and we want to partner with the US to deliver a just and lasting peace for Ukraine. Again, the difference of the language here is super important. Now is a critical moment, she says. So the EU supports Trump's position of peace through strength, but they want to get the strength bit first, not just peace. So Trump says peace through strength, but doesn't follow through on it at all. He wants peace at any cost as soon as possible. EU is ready to provide security guarantees, the terms of which will be discussed with each party depending on the level of American support. But there have, of course, been lots of concerns raised. So there you go. Keith Kellogg is due to visit Ukraine imminently. Now, the key statements following the meeting of the EU leaders. So Paris, Macron convened that meeting of all the EU leaders yesterday. Anton Gerashenko breaks some of it down. European Commission President von der Leyen and Antonio Costa that's the European Council President, made a joint statement, quote, today in Paris, we reaffirm that Ukraine deserves peace through strength, peace respectful of its independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and strong security guarantees. None of that language do we hear from the Americans. Europe carries its full share of the military assistance to Ukraine. At the same time, we need a surge in defense in Europe. British Prime Minister said there must be a US backstop because a US security guarantee is the only way to effectively deter Russia from attacking Ukraine again. So we still need the US. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said transatlantic relations and our friendship with the US are at a new stage. No one should probably be surprised that this meeting also confirmed that our European partners realise it's time has come for a much greater ability for Europe to defend itself. Then the Danish Prime Minister said Russia is threatening all of Europe now. I don't think they are going to stop in Ukraine, and therefore I'm very concerned about making a fast ceasefire because it could give Putin and Russia a possibility to go back and mobilise again, attack Ukraine or any other country in Europe, another country in Europe. So absolutely right there. The Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof saying not only Ukraine but Europe must take on its responsibility once a truce is reached between Russia and Ukraine. At this crucial time for the security of Europe, we must continue to stand behind Ukraine. This is in the interest of the Netherlands too. Europe will have to make a contribution towards safeguarding any agreement. The cooperation with the Americans is essential. That's something we are going to be looking at carefully in the period ahead. And again, all of these statements are actually directly in contradiction, but they are marked in the rhetoric they're using that is absent from the Americans. All of this kind of rhetoric is not what we hear from the Americans. The peace talks, says Pedro Sanchez from Spain, must actively involve the EU and Ukraine, reinforce a multilateral order and international law, and also reinforce Europe. And then the French President Macron said, according to the French president, security guarantees for Ukraine must be strong, otherwise there is a risk the ceasefire will end just like the Minsk agreements. He added that the European Commission will soon prepare proposals to extend aid to Ukraine. This agenda, defined in 2022 at the Versailles summit, must simply be carried out. Decisions, actions, coherence, quickly. A lot still to be hammered out there. Then there are these rumours, Annalena Baerbock saying, the German Foreign Minister, we will launch a large package that has never been seen on this scale before. The German minister said the financial package for security in Europe. Now, there are some rumours that this is going to be $700 billion, or euros, not sure, euros of aid, probably both to Ukraine and to Europe, if it is that much. If it's that much, it's clearly going to be using the $300 billion of frozen Russian assets, but it might not be true. So we don't know about that. Just bear in mind that it might not be that massive, but if it is, of course, that's fantastic, and would also dent the US's efforts in bringing this to a swift conclusion. It's not about that we don't want a quick conclusion to this. We'd love a quick conclusion if the conclusion was fair and just, right? But what we want is a fair and just conclusion. And so that is, I think, what Europe's position is, and giving the Ukrainians and the Europeans a massive boost like this will be a real kick in the shins for the US. But unfortunately, in Europe, there are also those, according to The Economist, who are eyeing up the resumption of large-scale purchases of Russian gas. So they want this to come to a quick conclusion because then they can make lots of money off, or at least save lots of money on cheaper gas. But the basic situation is that there are columns being written now. So this is a Financial Times column that would never have been written a month ago under the previous administration. So things have massively changed. It's clear that the US can no longer be regarded, says the Financial Times, as a reliable ally for the Europeans. But the Trump administration's political ambitions for Europe mean that for now, America is also an adversary, threatening democracy in Europe and even European territory in the case of Greenland. So I am saying what many others are saying. I'm attacking the Trump administration. When I say the US and America, that's what I mean. But they are an enemy. They are an enemy of Europe. They are an enemy of Ukraine now. And this is exactly what's being said here. So what to do? Europeans need to start preparing fast for the day when the US security guarantee to Europe is definitively removed. And that must involve building up autonomous defence industries. It should also mean a European mutual defence pact outside of NATO that extends beyond the EU to include Britain, Norway and others. Trump will use any leverage he has to force America's European allies into compliance on issues from trade and security to their domestic politics. That means that Europe must now start the painful process of de-risking its relationship with the US, looking for areas of dangerous dependence on America and stripping them out of the system. This will not be for the benefit of America, by the way, of the US. It will be, though, and the BBC News report last night was talking about this, it will be super expensive for all European nations. And that's a problem. That the right thing to do at the moment is the expensive thing to do, and it will be the politically unpopular thing to do with many in the population. Not because they don't want to support Ukraine, not because they don't want strong strong defense forces and defense infrastructure. Everyone wants all of those things, but everyone has their priorities. And for many people, immigration is a big thing, right? Or education or healthcare. And these moves will probably almost certainly come at the expense of expenditure on other elements of the national infrastructure. Now, Zelensky is in Turkey at the moment, and he was in the UAE. But I found this quite an interesting, the way this was written. I was wondering whether it is a little bit, not desperate, but, you know, there's a recognition that Europe are the mates now and the US aren't. I just had a long conversation with President of France, Emmanuel Macron, following his meeting today with the other European leaders to discuss the global situation, the state of affairs in Europe, and security guarantees for Ukraine. We share a common vision. Security guarantees must be robust and reliable. Any other decision without such guarantees, such as a fragile ceasefire, would only serve as another deception by Russia and a prelude to a new Russian war against Ukraine in other European nations. Emmanuel, so not just Macron, Emmanuel also briefed me on his talks with other leaders, not just European ones. We agreed to stay in constant contact as major decisions are being made. Ensuring a robust and lasting peace is a must, and that can only be achieved through strong security guarantees. So he's positioning himself, it appears, closer to Europe. Yulia Sviridenko said, more good news as Ukraine has signed a historic comprehensive economic partnership agreement with the UAE. So while the Riyadh talks were going on, Zelensky was in the UAE. This unique agreement essentially opens doors to the global market, considering the UAE's role as a key economic trade and financial hub in the Middle East. The UAE is a leader of logistics and trade, which increasingly provides Ukraine with unprecedented opportunities. Secondly, this is not a traditional free trade agreement. The impressive scope is comprehensive, covering goods, services, investments, digital trade, and much more. Even short-term analysis shows that this agreement will help maintain a positive trade balance in merchandise trade. In the medium and long term, the partnership alone is expected to contribute around 0.1% to the Ukraine's GDP growth trajectory. The agreement was signed jointly with the UAE minister, blah, 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 blah. And it provides, you know, liberalisation of markets, etc. Lots of things there. Awful lot of to go through there. I won't do it now. But it's interesting that straight away Zelensky was trying to cozy up to, now that sounds pejorative, to try and gain influence within the broader region where the US and Russia were meeting, to try and garner some economic benefits from there. And then he went to Turkey, where he's been today, I think. Erdogan welcomed Zelensky, who is paying an official visit to Turkey. Erdogan has initiated bilateral talks with Zelensky regarding the resolution of the war in Ukraine. According to the Turkish leader's office, discussions aim to address the ongoing conflict and explore diplomatic solutions. It could be that Zelensky says, actually, I want Turkey to be the mediators here. And actually, Turkey's an interesting one, because they're in NATO, but they also launder an awful lot of Russian money. They have a foot on both sides of the fence. They haven't sanctioned Russia. So I think that could be an interesting move. We've got Yana Puglierin saying, I fear that this will not only be about Ukraine, but a much larger deal. So the whole kind of Riyadh deal, but a much larger deal on European security architecture and a new US relationship with Russia, 100%. Trump and Putin share interest when it comes to American troop presence in Europe, withdrawal of US capabilities, NATO enlargement. They can go big. Trump, with his isolationism, will be willing to do everything that Russia wants. And that's the important point. Russia are likely to get what they want out of this deal because Putin and Trump are aligned on an awful lot more than you might imagine. So the UK Prime Minister, Keir Starmer here, let's listen to him.
Facing a generational challenge when it comes to national security. Obviously, the immediate question is the future of Ukraine, and we must...
So, notice the difference here. The Americans, Marco Rubio, put Ukraine as second. That's secondary to the US's economic interests and starting to work much more closely on projects with Russia. That's what his first objective was. Keir Starmer here is that obviously the initial concern is Ukraine. That's the difference between Europe and the US.
Must continue to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position, whatever happens next.
Again, the US have not said they want to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position. That's what European leaders are saying. It's not what US leaders are saying. So if you're going to disagree with me, you're disagreeing with what the people are actually saying.
And to make sure that if there is peace, and we all want peace, that it is lasting. I think there's a bigger piece here as well, which is that this isn't just about the front line in Ukraine, it's the front line of Europe and of the United Kingdom. It's about our national security. And I think that we need to do more, we need to step up.
Unfortunately, didn't say the word just there. I'd like to have heard that. Now, Shashank Joshi says in the Financial Times, or is quoting from there, I don't know if it's him. No, it's not him, he's the Economist. So he's quoting from, Germany, Poland and Spain signalled reluctance to dispatch peacekeeping forces. Finland's foreign minister also expressed scepticism to me on Friday about feasibility of Finland sending troops. That's him talking now. They won't be the only sceptics, but a lot depends on the US backstop. So there's lots of talk about the US and whether they'll help with security guarantees. But the UK and France certainly seem to be up for troops or committed to troops in Ukraine. But lots of people, I had one kind of Russian shill on my threads this morning, Tezzy, who is just basically a Russian shill, saying, oh, look how rubbish it is. Europe can't even agree. I'm like, no. But do you know what? This isn't the most important thing at the moment. There's loads of steps before you get to peacekeeping forces in Ukraine. So although it's good that I think Starmer committed to that, it's actually kind of the least important aspect of what's taking place at the moment. So James Cameron saying, I think Starmer now gets it. It might not be enough, but it's a start. So what's he talking about? UK's Keir Starmer speaking now. This is in The Guardian. He says that at stake is not just the future of Ukraine, it's an existential question of Europe as a whole and once in a generation. So all that speech you just heard from, but extended a little bit there. Starmer is right, but I can't emphasize enough. All the options now, deployments to Ukraine, heavily arming Ukraine, if no security guarantees or if no deal and Trump cuts aid, or less likely but entirely possible, US pulls back from Europe, they are going to cost a lot of money. There are no cheap pathways now, and that's super, super important. Nothing's going to be cheap. Jimmy Rushton, who is a Kiev-based foreign policy and security analyst, he often has articles out there. 2 points. One, I'm not sure anyone expected Germany to deploy troops to Ukraine anyway. And two, there's an election in Germany in less than a week, with the front-running leader of the CDU, Friedrich Merz, already promising to be more hawkish on Ukraine than his predecessor. So the fact that Germany said, people like Tezzy, whatever, these things are getting worked out, and things can change. There will be a new German leadership in a week's time. French Foreign Minister Barrot has said it's unthinkable that Russia would return to the G7 to make it the G8 as Trump wants. So Trump just wants everything that's pro-Russian, and he wants Putin to be back in the G8. But luckily, at least the French there being very strong, is unthinkable. Good. And here we have the Financial Times saying the Trump administration. Now, you might think, why is this important? And I'm going to circle back to the Elon Musk thing. So Elon Musk has the Tate brothers making a lot of money on Twitter. So that's good for Elon Musk. But he's also aligned with this kind of thinking, this manosphere, where you have, Jordan Peterson, that kind of ecosystem that then filters down to the Tate brothers. And if you don't know the Tate brothers, they are despicable human beings. Now, they are at the moment under arrest or they're not allowed, I don't think, to leave Romania. The US is apparently putting pressure on the Tate brothers to be released from Romania. This is absolutely disgusting. So, that's why I keep talking. When I mention Elon Musk, it's because it's necessary to understand his broader context. There are two things. He wants his ecosystem to exist that will also make him money. These people will make Elon Musk money. He wants his ecosystem to exist, but he also, and he understands his base, Musk, but he also wants to be working against the EU. Why? Because the EU are going to regulate the heck out of Twitter or X. So this is all connected, which then sees Musk aligning himself with Putin and Russia more than the EU and Ukraine. This is all connected. And then he can inform people's opinions about Ukraine in a negative way. So Financial Times says the Trump administration has pressured Romanian authorities to lift travel restrictions on the self-described misogynist influencer Andrew Tate, a champion of the US president who is facing criminal charges in Bucharest. Eric Michael Garcia says, I went to a Trump rally where people called, so he's a DC bureau chief, independent and MSNBC columnist. I went to a Trump rally where people called Joe Biden a paedophile. Ron DeSantis' team called people who opposed their bill groomers. Nancy Mace accused trans people of being sex creeps. All the while, the Trump administration is asking for leniency of an alleged sex trafficker. And by the way, Trump himself is a convicted or is a felon. He's been found he's a felon, and he's also been found liable by a court of his peers for sexual abuse himself. Him and Elon Musk have had 17 children with 7 different women. And I think Elon Musk has been accused of sexual abuse as well. Am I correct in saying? So this is all just it's horrendous, and the hypocrisy is rank. Edward Hunter Christie says, to my understanding, the Tate brothers manipulate young women into being cam girls. They then impersonate the cam girls and train others to do so in text communication, so the cam girls are leveraged a second time as romance scams. They then hoover up all the cash. Trump material, in other words. Okay, now we have the Matthew Jury. That's a bit of nominative determinism. Matthew Jury, who is a lawyer for the victims of the Tate brothers, saying, I've seen reporting which suggests that individuals associated with the Trump administration have applied pressure on the Romanian authorities to lift the travel restrictions currently imposed on Andrew Tate. As a lawyer of some of the UK victims of Tate's alleged crimes, I find this development, if true, truly bizarre, equally bizarre and outrageous. Tate's movements have been restricted for a reason, because he's plotted to intimidate and interfere with the victims and witnesses, and because there have been concerns about him fleeing the most serious charges of human trafficking and rape. The US shouldn't be interfering based on Elon Musk's political whims and predilections and the money Tate makes him on X. Let's not forget, Tate isn't only facing prosecution in Romania, but also in the UK. Free speech shouldn't trump established law and due process. The Romanian and UK authorities should be left alone to do their job. And there's an article on that. But this is terrible. What has the US become? The US are standing up for the most disreputable people in the world, whether it be Kylin Georgescu in Romania, whether it be Alice Weidel in Germany, whether it be Vladimir Putin and fricking Sergei Lavrov in Russia, whether it be the Tate brothers in Romania. It is disgusting who the US is advocating for at the moment. The moral compass of the US has been inverted, and it needs to be changed. There needs to be a change of administration in the United States. Because if you ask people individually whether they would vote for this, all the people that voted for Trump, there will be a lot of people that I'm sure will be really in favour of the Tates, but certainly not the scale of people who voted for Trump. Like, is this really what you wanted? Is this the kind of moral compass that you want to be your American government? And then it just gets worse. One of Elon Musk's Doge kids, so one of the people that's now shutting down the government, Ed Korestein, appears to be a member of Andrew Tate's online university. So now we're seeing all the connections. Research documents show that the account created in May 2023 is tied to an email belonging to Korestein. The site had a data breach in November, but only Korestein's email and username got leaked. So, yeah, who knew? Who knew? And then we hear that Doge is continuing to shut down and audit and shut down those departments that are investigating SpaceX, Tesla, Elon Musk himself personally. So, as Dean Blundell, so he's auditing every government body that was or is actively investigating him. America is a pure banana republic. So Doge is to audit and investigate effectively the Securities and Exchange Commission for fraud and waste. Just what is going on? You've got to the point where even John Major, the former Conservative Prime Minister in the UK, saying there's an ugly nationalism growing, mostly from the intolerant right. Now, I know people on the right will say, oh, the left, cancel culture, blah, blah, blah. By the way, just to remind you, I have literally lost 2 jobs because of the religious right. So if you're talking about being cancelled, have you been cancelled? I have been cancelled. I've lost 2 jobs because of the religious right. One of them I can't talk about due to I can't talk about it in public, so you can't know about that. But another one, I lost a job as a writer at Pathos Non-Religious because the organisation, as an interfaith dialogue organisation, was taken over by an intolerant religious person who didn't want lefty liberals and atheists having opinions on politics, and the entire non-religious cadre got shut down. We were cancelled, and we all lost our jobs writing because he didn't like our political outlook. And funnily enough, though, we were like just a non-religious channel of all these religious channels and all these different channels. And our little channel made, because most people were more interested in what we said than what all these other people are saying, we made them 50% of their income, and we have 50% of their viewers, which is connected. And they just shut us down because they didn't want. So I lost that job. I lost another job as a result of the religious right as well. So don't lecture me on cancel culture. I debated David French on cancel culture on Premier Christian Radio. You can go and check that out. It's on my other channel, or you can check it out on probably the Premier Christian Radio channel. So I have strong views on cancel culture, and it isn't just a left thing, not by a long way. If you're talking about religious intolerance, if you're talking about right-wing intolerance, it is there. And John Major is talking about this. So he says, this is a very unsettled time. There is an ugly nationalism growing, mostly from the intolerant right, so it's a very unsettled time. I got a lot of time for John Major. He's actually, I'm not a conservative. I'm not, I don't sit on the right, but he was a humane, temperate voice, wise. He was a moderate sort of conservative that, the sort of conservatism I wish was back in the United States and in the UK. But we kind of lost that. We've not lost it. They just don't have a home. They've been overtaken by this populist far right that we see in the form of Elon Musk, that we see in the form of Nigel Farage. And that Kemi Badenoch in the UK is wondering whether she takes the Conservative Party in that direction or not. And she's having a bit of an identity crisis at the moment. Now, Slovakia has said they will never agree to Ukraine's NATO membership and will not send its troops there. So there could be some challenge within NATO to Ukraine's accession or security guarantees. When you've got Fico's Slovakia and Orban's Hungary, both in NATO and the EU, there are challenges ahead. Anne Applebaum reports that, well, actually, this is an article in a conservative newspaper by a conservative, I believe. Canada's relationship with the US can't be saved. That is the headline by Mark Norman, the former Vice Chief of the Canadian Defence Staff. These are bad times for American relationships with all their allies. And who are America cozying up to? Frickin' Russia. That's all you need to know. And it appears Lukashenko. So just to remind you that they've lifted sanctions, the Americans, on Lukashenko and Belarus for things like potash. Why? As I said yesterday, because they are going to be putting sanctions on Canada. And Canada is one of the biggest exporters of potash to the United States, which is involved in fertilizers. So they know they are going to put tariffs on Canada again. So they're lifting sanctions on Belarus so that they can get their potash from Belarus instead of Canada. This has nothing to do with sanctioning Belarus for geopolitical, strategic, moral reasons. This is all to do with engorging themselves economically, the US. So they'll lift sanctions, even though that's geopolitically the wrong thing to do. They'll lift sanctions because they're planning on sanctioning, putting tariffs on Canada. And this allows them to still maintain a supply of potash. That is where we are at with the US at the moment. And meanwhile, the CIA have been meeting with Lukashenko, and they are looking at normalizing relationships with yet another dictator. The US Trump administration are an adversary. Prove me wrong. That's enough from me, guys. Take care. It's been a long one, but my goodness, a lot is happening. I hope this is of use, and I'll speak to you soon.